again. 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. I just got a new computer, so it's making me log into everything again, and I forgot that I would have to do that to get into Prezi. You shouldn't have to do that. It's just because I'm the owner of this particular Prezi. But when we're talking about literary theories, here's what you need to know. A literary theory is a lens that we use to analyze a piece of writing. It's also a way to look at the world, and it gives us rules and assumptions that we can work with to really dive deep into something. So one of the literary theories is psychoanalytical. You may be familiar with this if you've heard of Freud. And the big idea with this is that all of a character's actions are driven by some kind of subconscious thing that has happened to them in the past. So Freud talks about the id, the ego, and the superego. And, what is it about a person that causes them to act the way that they do? So some questions you could ask: what is the psychological component of the characters? There's some kind of Oedipus complex at work. What motivates this character subconsciously to act the way this character does? Okay. So that's psychoanalytical. Feminist looks at how women are treated in comparison to men. Typically, it focuses on the oppression of women. You have to be careful with this one. Sometimes this is actually changed more to gender theory. And we've also added in LGBTQ into this theory. So also looking at how various sexual orientations are treated in comparison to their counterparts. So there's a lot of different directions you can go with this one. Feminist is sort of where that all came from or started from. So how are women or minorities treated in this story? What kind of stereotypes, gender stereotypes, things like that are at work in this story? I will tell you, if you have a story that does not have, female characters in it, you can't really do feminism unless you want to talk about that the author must hate women because he refuses to put women in his stories, something like that. But you really have to have a female character to use feminist theory. So just something to think about there. Marxist looks at economic and cultural theories of Karl Marx. So it looks at rules, class structure, those who have versus those who do not. So those who have power and those who don't, those who have money specifically, and those who don't, those who are of an upper class versus those who are of a lower class. So if you've ever watched something like Downton Abbey, that's a great analysis of British life in the late 1800s, early 1900s, using some Marxist ideas, upstairs, downstairs, same sort of thing. Looking at those who have versus those who have not. You also see this in things like the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen. So those who have money and power versus those who don't, and what does that affect on the story? Dickens would also be another one who would talk about this. So things you could consider when you're reading and using this one: who has the money and who doesn't, who has power and who doesn't. What role does money, power, and class play in the story, and what difference does it make because some have and some do not? All right, and the last one is post-colonial and historical. You could separate these out, but a lot of people put them together, mostly because it's looking at the influence of time and history on a piece of writing. So if we're looking at post-colonial, we're looking more at the conquered versus the conqueror. Typically, we're looking at what happens when Western powers conquer other cultures. Probably the most famous example of this is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or the movie Apocalypse Now, which talks about Africa. We also look at this with India, the British and the way they conquered India, things like that. So how are other cultures viewed in relation to Western dominance? And a lot of that, again, is America and the British versus other cultures. So So looking at when was this written and how does the fact that the author lived during that time period influence the story? So the fact that, Poe was writing during a very specific time period, or Hawthorne was writing during a very specific time period, or Ray Bradbury in Fahrenheit 451, why does the fact that he's writing in the 1950s, how does that affect the way they write their stories? Who wins and who loses? And how is the West portrayed in relation to other cultures? So you kind of have a mix of two different theories going on there, but because they all relate to time period, a lot of times we put them together. All right, the last one and probably the most common one is archetypal. So this is looking at reoccurring characters and images or symbols. So looking at a specific symbol, to do this kind of paper, you would choose one symbol, not lots of symbols. You would pick one symbol from the story and then talk about what does it represent throughout the whole story. So we call it archetypal when we see the same idea repeated over and over and over again in literature and used the same way. One of the best examples, of course, is the idea of white and black. White being sort of that angelic, good, innocent, versus black, which is sort of that, evil, despair idea. So that's a pretty common one that we see all throughout literature. So some questions you could ask: what characters have I encountered? Do I have like an archetypal character? So something like the epic hero, the villain, the orphan, the helpless woman, the mentor, the evildoer, so on, so on, so on. Or on the flip side, if I'm not talking about a character, I can also talk about a specific symbol, so an image that may have a really deep meaning. So white, black, light and dark, water, fire, numbers, all kinds of things like that. So symbol, archetypal is probably the most common one that my students choose. But again, remember one symbol. Okay. So we'll skip out on the practice. You're welcome to take a look at that. There's a couple of YouTube videos from different movies and see if you can identify some of the archetypal or